Hello and welcome back, and that is right. Today we want to talk about this. This is the Samsung 990 EVO, Samsung's first commercial Gen 5 SSD. I don't think a lot of users, myself included, were wondering when this rolled out the gate, what took so bleeding long? Samsung, in the previous generation of SSDs, get ready for a bit of storytelling, come join me by the fire. In the previous generation of SSDs, the Gen 4 generation, Samsung absolutely stuck the landing with the Samsung 980 Pro. If you've been looking at SSDs for laptops, for gaming, for PlayStation, for PC, for whatever, in the last 3 or 4 years, chances are this SSD kept appearing on your radar. That was because in the Gen 4 generation of SSDs, otherwise known as PCIe Gen 4x4, when those SSDs started rolling out the gate with their promises of 5,500 megabytes per second, Samsung, along with WD, rocked out the gate in winter, the end of year 2020, stretched their muscles and threw this out there. The 7,000 megabytes per second Gen 4 SSD with insane IOPS values and even a performance in the the write sequential performance in excess of 5,000 megs. And the rest of the industry went, I'm sorry, what? And for the years that followed, it ensured that all the other SSD manufacturers out there, be they those that were using third-party components from companies like Phison or brands that were rocking out the gate with their own proprietary pre-built solutions, were trying to play catch-up. And it allowed Samsung and WD to largely dominate the Gen 4 marketplace for the first year to year and a half of that industry. Which is why, in this long introduction, when we got to Gen 5, a lot of users were wondering why, as Seagate were rocking out the gate, as MSI were rocking out the gate, as everyone else, even brands coming out of Japan that didn't hugely have enormous infrastructure outside of those countries, like Next Storage, numerous brands under the A-Data label, all of those were rocking out the gate with Gen 5 SSDs that were going 10 gigabytes per second, 12 and even 14 gigabytes per second more recently with the maximum SSD from Phison. Why was Samsung waiting this long? And more importantly, why, when they did rock out the gate, have they released what I would argue to be one of the weirdest SSDs they have ever released? So I feel perhaps things got just a tad emotional there. This is the Samsung 990 EVO SSD. It's consumer focused, and although I would argue gamers may be looking at this as a drive, I think this is one of their more niche releases. And we'll be going through some scenarios, by the way, where this drive would be appropriate. So don't worry, this isn't just going to be some big flame war vid where we tear it a new one. I think there is a reason for this drive existing, but there's no denying that given Samsung's prolific and well-established history in the world of solid-state drives, particularly M2 NVMe when they absolutely smashed it with the 960 originally, I would say this is a drive that I think displeases more people than it pleases. If you're in one of those pleased categories, by the way, you're going to love this drive. But this is a 2280 length standard class M2 NVMe. It runs on Gen 5x2 architecture, or it can be utilised in a Gen 4x4 lane. Now, immediately out the gate, there's going to be users watching this going, well, of course, all of PCIe architecture is backwards compatible. If I was to take a Gen 5 SSD like this one, this is the Next Storage N5EM, and I took this, which is a Gen 5x4, and stuck it in the Gen 4x4 slot, it would auto-negotiate down. Of course it would. That's not new, to have an SSD that can run in 2 different bandwidth. That's just called backwards compatibility and auto-negotiation, and you're right, to a point. Now, the reason I bring that up, and one of the main focuses, and something, frankly, Samsung is banking on with this SSD, is the fact that newer generation laptops, newer generation portable hardware architecture is going to need to be 2 very important things. 1, efficient. 2, power efficient. Now, they sound like the same thing, right? But they're not. 1 is to do with basically the general layout and the hardware components you've got at your disposal. Great example, this is a mini PC we focused on the channel recently. This is the B-Link, the SEI. It's an i5 12th gen mini PC. Now, as good as that sounds, that is running not on a traditional big highfalutin PC CPU, it's running on what's known as an SoC CPU, mobile effectively, and it's a much more scaled down version of that CPU, where economies of scale, economies of power consumption, heat generation, and ultimately the number of lanes afforded to the architecture have to be made. The result is that this system, although it's running a highfalutin CPU, the designers have to be incredibly ornate and strategic about how many lanes they assign to different hardware components. Not only out of the sheer number of physical lanes afforded to them, but also the power consumption and the heat generated in such a compact form there. This is a Gen 4 system there. The same goes when you're looking at pre-built PCs or hardware upgrade components such as M2 NVMe upgrade cards, like this one from OWC, or adapter cards that allow you to use multiple M2 NVMe's. All of these are built around the idea that you are being a far more curated individual about the lanes afforded to you, or that the number of lanes being afforded to you, such as the times 16 slot, have to be divided in the most efficient way possible, which is where this drive comes in. Now, the reason they've gone for this whole Gen 5 times 2 and also Gen 4 times 4 architecture support compatibility is so. If you are running a system that's got a Gen 4 times 4 slot, which is quite common now for your M2 NVMe, this will give you that full bandwidth. It won't give you the performance for reasons we'll talk about later on in hardware architecture, but if you're running a Gen 5 supporting CPU and they've had to be far more curating about the number of lanes afforded to it, such as in this one where it is a times 2 M2 NVMe slot in the base, the result is that if you took a Gen 5 times 4 M2 NVMe, it will be restricted to times 2. So if you took one of these, it would immediately limit you down to those 2 lanes afforded to you. This is the maximum drive, and it would halve the performance. But worse still, if you used a Gen 4 drive inside a system like this, which is what most of these systems arrive with, by the way, they very rarely put Gen 5 SSDs inside these. Indeed, you even find Gen 3 drives inside. The result would be that on the times 2 lanes they've afforded to the M2 NVMe slot inside there, on a Gen 3 drive, you would get under 2,000 megs. You probably get about 16 to 100 megabytes per second, and on a Gen 4 drive, you would be lucky to get 3,000 to 3,300 because it's halved the lanes. Whereas this drive allows itself on the Gen 5 times 2 architecture of one of these systems to use the full lanes. And if it's a Gen 4 times 2, it will still give you better performance than a Gen 4 drive would in the same circumstance. The Gen 5, the bifurcation of those PCIe lanes, although it sounds fantastically niche and it sounds fantastically rare, it is looking like the industry is going that way. It is looking like we're going to start seeing more prosumer laptops, more prosumer architecture hardware that is designed to be more power efficient and more lane efficient and architecture efficient internally for reasons of heat dissipation and the mobile SoC CPUs inside. It's all adding up to hardware in the future and that curated lane allocation, meaning drives like this are suddenly going to become more popular. However, let's actually keep our little tippy toes on the ground for a moment and get real, because this is not the ideal Gen 5 times 2 drive out there. Samsung have made choices on the architecture of this which boggle my mind. Not for in itself, because the choices I'm going to talk about in a moment do make sense within the wider SSD industry. I don't understand why Samsung picked this drive first, especially when you know that the 990 Pro came out recently before this. Now, this drive rocks out the gate with the Piccolo 6-core 32-bit ARM controller inside. It also arrives, and this is the 2TB model, with 2 NAND components. Let's get that label off of there. We can see the 2 NAND modules there. Now, given this is a Gen 5 SSD, unfortunately, these are not 232 layer NAND. They're not even 176 layer NAND. They are 2 modules of NAND flash at 133 layer 3D TLC NAND at 1200 megatransfers per second. That is substantially lower than the majority of drives in the marketplace right now. That is lower than some of their own more recently released drives there. But did you notice the other thing about that drive? The other rather glaring thing that seems to be missing on this drive? That's right, this drive is DRAMless. This is another drive that's arrived in the market recently that takes advantage of HMB, host memory buffer. In other words, taking advantage of a small area of memory on the host client system, your Windows, your Mac system, or your third-party server if it's supported. And then instead of using NAND on the drive, it's using NAND on the OS as caching, which can be beneficial in terms of heat generation, in terms of power efficiency. Again, exactly what this drive is aiming for, but there's no denying if you're using a third-party system that does not support host memory buffer, you're going to come away from that disappointed there. Now, again, this SSD here does not arrive with a heat sink there, so in returning to that subject of heat generation, there is a base copper heat shield there to kind of draw some of that heat through, but that top sticker I removed is just a standard adhesive sticker there, nothing much to write home about. And when we look at the architecture of this drive in terms of performance and what you, the end user, are getting, the peak performance reported by Samsung is 5,000 megabytes per second, sequential read, so those are synthetic benchmarks there, and in terms of write, same sequential synthetic benchmark of 4,200 megabytes per second. The 4K read and write random IOPS were reported at 680,000 over 800,000 on the 1TB, and on the 2TB 700,000 over 800,000. And again, there are going to be users that hear that and go, I'm sorry, what? Because when you look at Gen 5 and even Gen 4 drives, those are drives that have been cranking out 6,000 to 7,000 megs on Gen 4 and comfortably breaking 10,000 megabytes per second on Gen 5. And again, with more recent drives, we talked about hitting 14,000 or 14 gigabytes per second. Even the IOPS numbers at peak 700,000 over 800,000, absolutely just shake in their boots compared, remember, with the 2020 released drive from them, which was hitting 1 million. And since then, we have seen drives rocking out the gate at 1.2, 1.3, 1.5, and even 1.6 million 4K IOPS. Now, that is damning comparisons to be made against this drive, which only reverts us back to trying to defend it within this rather niche scenario that we talked about with curated PCIe cards like RAID cards, curated and controlled laptops, MacBooks, mini PCs, where the PCIe lanes have been, limited by using power efficient and heat efficient components, which have then limited the number of PCIe lanes to play with. But there's no denying that even if you are in that user case scenario where you've been limited down to Gen 5 times 2 lanes in a system, 5,000 megs is not a lot to write home about. Now, let's play devil's advocate ever so slightly. Devil's advocate, what about sustained performance? Because you're right, it's not about peak. One of the issues with Gen 5 for many, many years has been, I'll say many years, let's be realistic, about 18 months to 24 months. Gen 5 SSDs have got something of a problem with heat. They have something of a problem with sustained performance. Heat, because they get dang hot. Sustained performance, because although they make these big promises, the cache gets oversaturated, and we suddenly see a drive that was hitting 10,000 megabytes per second, suddenly gutter ball down there into 400 megs, 1,000 megs, maybe 1,800 megs. This has been a constant problem with Gen 5 SSD because the surrounding infrastructure can only handle so much data. The bandwidth is there, but the performance and the water going through the pipe is finite, and management of it is finite. Now, this will provide a more sustained number. However, remember, that sustained number started lower in the first place. On top of that, even the IOPS, that sustained IOPS of 700 over 800, we've seen other drives in the Gen 4 sector manage that number for longer. And again, we are still talking 4x4 architecture, not this x2 Gen 5 stuff we're talking about here. But nonetheless, it does somewhat water down how useful sustained performance on this will be. And then we still have to include the fact that it doesn't have onboard DRAM, which you would hope would lower the pricing. But with this drive looking like it's rocking out the gate at 109 to 119 for the 1TB, and the 2TB rocking out the gate at about 179 to 189, the pricing, at least at launch, is not out of this world either. So what are we left to talk about? Well, we can talk about durability. Before we go on to the performance numbers, what about durability? Well, I would say those are a little bit more pleasing, or at least standard. With an MTBF at 1.5 million, apparently there's geared components for that to ensure that the power on efficiency, or power on, power off, and cycles are more, and the mean time between failure is still high. But a lot of people don't really rely on mean time between failure anymore, because it's more of a data center equation than a consumer. If we look at the durability, durability on this is rated at 600 and 1200 for the 1TB and 2TB terabytes written in its TBW rating on this, which goes down to a drive writes per day, which is how much or what percentage or what decimal percentage you can reuse and recycle the data on the drive, of a rating at 0.3 to 0.31 drive writes per day on this, which is alright. This is pretty much everything Samsung's done up to this point. Until you get to quad layer cell NAND, you're still going to be seeing a drive write per day rating of 0.3. It's a fairly standard number there, which for a DRAMless drive, I would still say is pretty good that they've maintained those numbers. But nevertheless, there's no avoiding that this is a drive that is super niche, and still comes back to that question of why Samsung released their first Gen 5 consumer drive in this way. But why don't we get this on the test machine and look at things like temperature? Let's take a look at things like sequential and IOP performance, and ultimately see if this drive here can cut mustard. Over here on the test machine, I think it's fair to say that, once again, we are going to have to look at the results that the Samsung 990 EVO achieved within a certain context. And unfortunately, there's a lot of users that are just not going to be happy with what they see here if they look at this drive in a conventional manner. Now, I've opened it up here on Crystal Disk Info, and one of the things you can see straight away is this drive has switched to its PCIe Gen 5 ×2 mode. Now, even though I applied it to a ×4 lane, the drive is clearly not opened up. You know, Samsung have made it abundantly clear about this. That is what their expectations for this drive are. And indeed, if you dig in to the Samsung Magician tool here, because we are testing this drive prior to its official launch, unfortunately I can't utilize all of the abilities of the Magician tool, such as the firmware updates that haven't become available yet on the database. When we look at the performance benchmarks there, we can see those numbers at 4,700 or so, and over 3,700 at sequential read over write. With IOPS numbers there, probably less than I think a lot of you would like to see. Now, one of the things I'm going to do with that test here on screen, and we do have OBS here running in the background, is we're going to come back to Samsung Magician later on. But real quick, I'm just going to open up Crystal Disk Mark here. Have that there in the background. On Crystal Disk, we're going to select the D drive, which is what the Samsung 990 EVO, which has been running now for the better part of around about a day or so. If we rescan this drive, that should rectify those power on hours there, which are incorrect. If we have a look, we can go ahead and go for a nice simple 1 GB test file there on that drive. I'm going to leave that running there, because I think it's going to be very important for you to see what a DRAMless drive without a heatsink attached is going to hit in terms of temperature. Now let's close that there. Let's actually reopen that up while it's performing its test. As you can see, it's hitting sequential read there over at 5,000 or 5 gigabytes per second there. But straight away, we're seeing that temperature go up. This isn't an unconventional number by any degrees. This is a 1 GB test file. This isn't too much to be concerned with. If we refresh those results there, you can see that number already getting into the 50s. Now, this is a drive that is clearly taking advantage of that host memory buffer on this Windows machine. We're running a Windows 10 Pro setup here. Bring the system properties up. We can see Windows 10 Pro running on an i5 12th gen i5 system there with 16 gig of DDR5 memory. No GPU card to speak of there, but still nonetheless, that temperature is climbing quite substantially there, as you can see. And that was a relatively light test it should be added there. When we look at that result there of that test we're conducting, it hasn't even concluded, and we're seeing that temperature go high. So one of the things that really surprised me about Samsung rolling this drive out such as they have, this is, let's face it, it's their first consumer grade, technically Gen 5 SSD. The fact it hasn't arrived with a heatsink, when being DRAMless, it is going to generate a degree of heat. I'm kind of surprised by hitting those temperature numbers. Now, I could have avoided this substantially by attaching, you know, a heatsink or a fan-assisted heatsink, as is the recommendation for Gen 5 SSDs. But I think then we would be skewing the results, as it were, because then we would be looking at a drive that isn't supplied officially with a heatsink there. And I think we have to look at this drive within that context. Now, we refresh that there. It's now the temperature is coming down. That's something I will say for DRAMless SSDs. They have a tendency to dissipate that heat a great deal more quickly than their RAM-assisted brethren. And if we go ahead and make our way into the temperatures here, so if we go ahead into the graph there, we can look at the temperature here on screen. This is the testing we've just performed when we had that drive going up to 43 here. Testing was separated over the course of 2 different days, as you can see there. And if we focus a little bit more readily on the first range of tests, these are our earliest crystal disk mark tests there. And our very earliest test, the drive, during initial booting of the system, and when we were creating our storage area, the drive hit 75 degrees, which was really surprising there. Now, as we went into the Atto testing, something I'll show you later on, the drive got as high as 67, 68. These are by no means throttle marks at all. No drive would throttle at 67 or 68 degrees. Once again, these are also synthetic tests and therefore are not fully representative of day-to-day utilization. Nevertheless, these still indicate to me that this is a drive that requires a heatsink to be utilized. And given that this is a Gen 5 x2 SSD, and one of its main selling points, I might add, is that it's designed to be a Gen 5 SSD that's going to have a lower overall system and system temp and power efficiency, I'm kind of surprised at the heat raising as much as it was. Now, let's actually get our teeth into the performance benchmark results here on screen. This grid mark here, as you can see, top left, 1 gig, 4 gig. We got another 4 gig up there, and we had a 16 gig down there. So there are our layer of results here. Indeed, why don't we, while we're talking, run another little test here in the background. Bear in mind that when we are conducting these tests, we are using OBS, and unfortunately that will make its mark there on the performance measurements. So we're not really going to rely too much on this 64 gig test here. We're just going to leave that there running in the background, one, for the sake of system temp, but also just get a nice little basis of comparison there with that huge 64 gigabyte test file being read and written to the Samsung 990 EVO SSD. But once again, we can see the performance numbers there comfortably at the 5 gigabytes per second in all 4 of our tests. And in the writes, we saw it capping there at 3,700. Now, again, because this drive has been limited to 2 lanes, there is an argument, as I mentioned earlier on, that a Gen 5 SSD that is 2 lanes set up in its architecture is going to be far more efficient with bandwidth utilization on a Gen 2 times 2 physical lane connection than a drive that ends up being throttled down from times 4 to a times 2, because it's designed to utilize the times 4, and therefore it isn't directly a mathematical half there. But still, we're seeing some great numbers there. The IOPS are pretty close to what we'd like to see if we were running maybe a particularly high-end AMD or Intel 13th gen processor, or even a Xeon. We might see more realistic IOPS numbers to what were proposed and advertised by the Samsung 990 EVO drive, so we're not really going to hold that against it. But even then, I'm not going to say I'm bowled over by these results. Obviously, we've got to look at these drives in context. We've got to look at this as a times 2 lane equipped SSD, but unfortunately, unless you're going to be utilizing in some of those specific setups we mentioned earlier on, like RAID cards, like PCs that are going to be very surgical about the lanes being utilized and equipped on a laptop, for example, or a Linux machine, I think most users in a conventional sense are going to be very disappointed with these numbers for an advertised Gen 5 PCIe drive. So moving away from Crystal Disk, why don't we have a little look at Atto Disk Benchmark. Here are 3 tests at 1/4 of a gig or 256 meg, 1 gigabyte and 4 gigabyte. That noise you heard there in the background is Crystal Disk advertising that the drive is getting warm. Again, 54, 55 degrees centigrade is not something to be concerned with. If we saw that number consistently in the 70s and 80s, then we'd have something to worry about. Again, a good heatsink would take care of that very easily. Now, we look at the numbers here. I've got a bit of a rotten cold. I apologise for my sniffles. We have a look here. We can see gigabytes, the translation over from megabytes there at 4.7, pretty consistently, and with the right there, sitting at 3.4, 3.5, pretty much throughout. And that's what we saw on the 1 gig and the 4 gig files, respectively. If you move over to the IOPS, of course, these are relative to the file size. So we're not thinking we're going to see anything too comparable to what we saw earlier on Crystal Disk anyway, but still nonetheless, reasonable numbers for this drive here. We're just going to kick that out there at the bottom. And then moving away from Atto, we can look at EVO SSD, another monitoring tool that tends to run its own race, or run its own rules for the race, so to speak. And as we can see, fairly consistent numbers. Generally, as a point of comparison, you do find that EVO SSD benchmarks are around about 8 to 10% lower than conventional tools like Crystal Disk. It doesn't mean that they're not right or one is righter than the other. It's just a different measurement and parameters there in terms of block size and more. But as you can see, fairly consistent numbers across the 3. There was a dip, arguably at the start of that EVO SSD read there. But apart from that, all fairly reasonable numbers across all of them. Now, I gotta say, I'm not bowled over by those numbers, and I get it. I really, really do. This is an SSD built for OSs. It's built as an OS drive. It's built as a RAID card drive. It's built for a setup where you can be selective and quite, for want of a better word, contrived about the PCIe lanes you are assigning to certain elements of your PC. Those mini PC builds where they really do have to get surgical, I get it. But this drive, I'm just, for the Samsung Gen 5 reveal for consumers, this is not a particularly impressive drive, unfortunately. And I know it's part of the EVO series, but even previous EVO drives were ×4. And the fact that the PCIe 4×4 speed is seemingly higher kind of disappoints me when you think of the bandwidth allocation of Gen 4 and Gen 5 SSDs right now at a similar price point to this. And I think we can't even blame the lack of RAM on this drive, the lack of DRAM. I think this performance number here is pretty underwhelming. Even if it did have DRAM and it, you know, clocked up a few thousand extra megs, I think this drive being host managed buffer and being a drive that's 5×2, much like when I had my complaints about their external USB drives arriving with that 20 gig USB 3.2 Gen 2 X2 connection. This is a very strange and very specific architecture to make the most of this drive. However, returning to Samsung's Magician tool, I think it still has to be put out there. This still is, to date, the very best client tool I've ever used. I've dealt with a lot of SSD brands over the years, and they've all got kind of their own Windows or Mac client tool that you can install. But Samsung Magician has always been kind of the best of the rest, and although you can use some of the services with third-party drives, the only way you're going to be able to use all of the apps and services that are built into it is using a Samsung drive. It's kind of part of the price of admission. To put that into perspective, for example, with the drive here, and we've got it all loaded in here with the latest firmware, you can see not only is it telling us that we're using that host memory buffer feature that's built in because of our Windows machine, but on top of that, from it, we can actually do certain tweaks on this drive, which otherwise would not be open to us. So for example, if we wish, we can switch to performance mode. This will enable elements of this drive, such as taking advantage of the trim feature functionality and taking advantage of the over-provisioning OP, where an area of the drive is utilized as a kind of additional cache space there. So, as you can see, it's going to have to restart it. So, we're going to not do that now, but I think even if we did run that performance mode, that might increase some of our performance numbers a fraction, but it's not going to do a huge amount
and even then these would still be synthetic tests. Nevertheless, the fact that we can re-gear this drive on the fly is a very, very useful feature. Same goes with kind of tailoring and configuring that over provisioning just a wee bit there, and just some real-time information about the drive that otherwise wouldn't be made available. And then you've got features such as secure erasure of data on that drive. You've just got lots of features and services built in here, along with password locks as well, and encryption that, again, are included, but I'm only giving them a half compliment to the drive, because a lot of this comes down to more Samsung Magician, again, something you get with any Samsung drive, than you do with specifically the Samsung 990 EVO SSD there. Ultimately, I like what I'm seeing here in terms of this software, something I've said time and time and time again. However, I'm still struggling ever so slightly to understand why Samsung rolled out this quasi mixture of Gen 4 and Gen 5 for their first consumer Gen 5 SSD, given Gen 5 being in the market a couple of years overall, when they could have gone for a more confident stride like they took in the Gen 4 generation with the Samsung 980 Pro. And again, when we look at the 990 series, we can go to my pictures here, and we can see these are from tests that we conducted a little while ago when we were looking at the 990 Pro, a Gen 4 locked SSD. There are two things to keep on board here. Number one, this is a Gen 4 drive, not a Gen 5, but it's still hitting higher performance numbers than the numbers that we've just talked about just now in a Gen 5 configuration. But the second thing to bear in mind is, if we took this Gen 4 drive and stuck it in a Gen 5 x 4 slot, which is conventionally what the majority of Gen 5 M2 slots are, we would get these numbers. We would not get these numbers if we'd have put the Pro Series drive in that bay. I hope that is clear enough. Ultimately, what I'm saying is, I'm struggling for anyone who is commercially buying this drive why they would not just immediately opt for the Pro Series drive, which has the DRAM and gives you that guaranteed high performance in both a Gen 4x4 and a Gen 5x4. And I apologise for being repetitious, but this constantly feels like the Samsung 990 EVO feels like an OEM drive. It feels like a drive that most people will never get their hands on, more buy a device and that drive is included inside. It does deliver on the promises that the brand says, and it does do exactly those numbers, and I think it will do those numbers in a far more sustained fashion. But those are still lower numbers over a sustained fashion, and therefore not the biggest boast once you start introducing comparisons with conventional drives. Let's head back to the studio and summarise today's review.
The verdict. I have a very complex relationship with this drive. There is no denying that it utilises less power than a lot of other SSDs in the market there. It is going to generate less heat than a lot of Gen 5 drives there on the market. And in certain deployment scenarios, such as mini PCs like this one, where curation and allocation of PCIEs is going to be far more curated, there is the potential in some scenarios to get better performance on this. We don't know where the market's going to go as these more power and scale efficient hardware client devices roll out in the next few years go. And in that world, in the future, Samsung may be doubling down on that. Also, that surgical level of PCI allocation isn't just for client PCs and client mini PCs for that matter, and MacBooks. When we look at PCIe cards that are rocking out the gate with a x16 slot that can be allocated across double-sided M2 NVMe's and giving users the ability to have RAID cards and HBA cards that will need to use either multiple M2 NVMe's at x2 speed, something we have seen before with larger scale RAID cards. This drive is going to be well placed for that, to allow better use and better performance overall on those more limited PCIEs and maximise them. Also, the Samsung Magician tool is still great. It's still the best client tool out there. And although you can get it with any Samsung SSD, hell, you don't even have to get a Samsung SSD to use it, it's still nice that it's rolled in to get some of the full capabilities out of this. And also, at least Samsung is entertaining and working within the Gen 5 market. And as a drive that has been slated to replace the EVO series drives that came before it, it is an upgrade from those. And if you are someone that's looking at a fast drive in your PC OS system and a 980 or 990 Pro seems a bit overkill, I can see why this drive wouldn't really, be, I can see why this drive would be better suited to those environments. But there's no avoiding, on the con side, this drive isn't going to please a lot of people. Phison have already started showing off their own Gen 5 DRAMless controller, the Phison 31T. And that drive has higher performance than this. Its overall typical performance numbers versus both Gen 4 drives and Gen 5 drives, and I am talking 4K IOPS, I am talking the random IOPS, I'm talking sequential, I'm talking day-to-day utilization, outside of those curated deployments, is just plain lower. This drive feels like an M2 NVMe that will be in a Steam Deck. It feels like a 2230 or 2242 mini SSD in the Gen 4 generation for Steam Deck and the other mobile handheld PC devices that are starting to rock out, aping the Steam Deck. This feels like one of those drives, not a full-length 2280 inside a PC. That the host-managed buffer, HMB support for the instead of a DRAM on this, is going to be OS dependent. It's going to be client system dependent, and it's going to result in the drive bottlenecking itself in certain deployments if you can't take advantage of it, if you can't allocate that memory. This drive feels like it should have come out a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, when Gen 5 was first rolling out as Samsung's first entry, not a Gen 5 drive that has arrived a year and a half to 2 years into the run of commercial Gen 5 SSDs out there. It's not a bad drive. It's not a consumer drive. This feels like an OEM drive. This feels like a drive that most users in the future will have and not know they bought it because they bought a laptop, they bought a MacBook, they bought a tablet or something where, you know, these innovations get bigger and they didn't even realize one of these was inside. This feels like the drive that you never knew you bought. But if you've got to make a conscious choice about buying a Gen 5 SSD, I think this drive is too niche. And I think there are users out there that are going to see this and think Samsung, they're the guys to go, and they're going to come away wanting. So, if you're looking at a laptop, if you're looking for a drive for a mini PC, a portable device, an HBA RAID or expander card, this may be the drive for you, where PCIe allocation is either fixed at a limited level or you have more control and you want to assign those lanes in a curated fashion. This drive is great for that. But for everyone else, there are better drives in the market, not just from other Gen 5 providers, but Samsung themselves, with the 990 Pro, the 980 Pro, and other drives that have rocked out and expanded in the Gen 4 arena. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think in the comments. There's a link to the written review below where we go into more detail and some of the close-up stuff on the chips for you to check out. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you do want to learn more about this drive, we're going to be doing our standard before you buy on this and comparing it against some other drives in the market right now. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching. Free advice section link below on NAScompares, the Discord, the Ask.NAScompares forum, and again, there is our Ko-Fi and Patreon pages there where you can join our membership program, or if you need Zoom consultations from me and Eddie, you can get those there. But apart from that, have yourselves a fantastic week.